presentation going. All right. All right. Awesome. So I hope everybody can see my presentation. My name is Stephanie Schmidt. I am the Whooping Crane Outreach Coordinator for the International Crane Foundation. And today in this program, I'm going to be talking about the two cranes that we have here in Wisconsin, the Whooping Crane and the Sandhill Crane. So in this program, I'm going to introduce you to the International Crane Foundation, give you kind of an idea of who we are and the work that we do. I'll introduce you to all 15 species of cranes, and then I'll really just hone in again on those two Wisconsin cranes. From there, I'll give you some sort of tips, tricks, and pointers for helping you identify these birds by sight and maybe even by sound as well. And then I'm going to really dive into the history of the cranes, talk about the Whooping Crane Reintroduction Program, and then from there I'll talk about some of the threats that the cranes continue to face and ways that you can be community advocates or stewards for cranes in your own backyard. So the International Crane Foundation, which is also called ICF, works worldwide to conserve cranes and the ecosystems, watersheds, and flyways on which they depend. The International Crane Foundation is headquartered in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and is located within the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people. As an organization, we acknowledge and honor the Ho-Chunk people as caretakers of the land and water since time immemorial, and as our neighbors, friends, and vital members of our community. The International Crane Foundation is dedicated to amplifying local voice and perspective in all the places where cranes dance. So pictured here, we have all 15 species of cranes. And you can see that all 15 species of cranes, they share a lot of similar features. They all appear to have very long beaks, small heads, and long necks. And with these sorts of lengthening features, you can probably gather that these birds are relatively tall as well. So the tallest of all 15 species of cranes, that's going to be the Saurus crane. It stands at 6 feet tall, and the Saurus crane can be found in both Australia and India. The shortest of all 15 species is the demoiselle, which stands at just about 2.5 to 3 feet tall, but still being the shortest species of crane, it does have one of the most impressive migrations, as the demoiselle crane will fly over the Himalayas on their migration. We can also see with the 15 species of cranes that there's a lot of similarity in the color patterns that we see with them. They all appear to have some sort of combination of black, white, gray, and red. All of them except the blue crane, which is also called the Stanley crane. As you can see, it has blue on its face, and the blue crane is actually the national bird of South Africa. There's also a lot of diversity in the places that we can find all 15 species of cranes. So we can find all of these cranes on all but 2 continents. So cranes can be found everywhere except in South America and Antarctica. And here in North America, we have 2 species of cranes, and both of them can also be found here in Wisconsin. So that's going to be the Whooping crane and the Sandhill crane. So the Sandhill crane is one of the most common species of cranes, one of the most common ones around the world, with there being over 800,000 of them found here in North America. And I'd wager a bet that everyone here has maybe seen, heard of, or heard a Sandhill crane before. On the other end of the spectrum here in Wisconsin, we have the Whooping crane, which is one of the rarest and most endangered species of cranes. Unfortunately, for cranes, being listed as threatened or endangered is not uncommon, as 10 out of the 15 species are listed as threatened or endangered. So all 15 species of cranes are dependent on wetlands to some degree, some more so than others. One of the most wetland dependent of all 15 species is the wattled crane. But with wetlands being one of the most threatened habitats around the world, it stands to reason that these very wetland dependent species are going to be threatened by that as well. But in addition to threats from habitat loss or habitat degradation, cranes also face threats from the illegal pet trade, poaching, disease, and really various other factors. But again, for today, we're really going to be focusing in on the 2 Wisconsin cranes, the Sandhill crane and the Whooping crane. And pictured here is the Sandhill crane. And before I dive into the history of this species, I really want to take a moment to kind of step back and familiarize everyone with what Sandhill cranes look like and sound like, because my goal is that by the end of this presentation, you can comfortably identify a Sandhill crane and a Whooping crane by sight, and maybe even by sound as well. So I'm going to start by playing the sound that these birds make, because oftentimes you're going to hear a Sandhill crane long before you see one, as their calls can carry for miles. And I hope that I remember to sync up the sound here. And if I didn't, somebody just come on and let me know if I forgot to click sound so you guys can hear it, but the sound should come out of your computer. But I'm going to play 2 calls here for the Sandhill crane. And when listening to these calls, I want you to notice kind of the rattling sort of characteristic behind these calls. So a sandhill crane's call is described as being a rattling karoo sound, and that comes from their curved trachea. So the sound kind of reverberates on its way up their trachea and makes that rattling sound. And the two calls that I'm going to play here are going to be a guard call and a unison call. And the guard call is kind of an alarm call. And it's the sound that you're going to hear sandhill crane make when it's in flight. So you may be much more familiar with this call, and I'll play that one for you now. All right, I hope everyone was able to hear that one. And the next call is going to be a unison call. And that unison call is going to be two birds calling at the same time. So you'll hear kind of an overlapping cacophony of sounds. And this unison call is used to kind of establish pair bonds. It really ramps up in frequency around the breeding season, but sandhill cranes can make this call year round. So I'll play that call for you now. So again, I hope you notice kind of the rattling behind that call. That's really characteristic to a sandhill crane. So sandhill cranes, they stand at 4 feet tall. As you can see from this sandhill crane that's in flight, it's flying with its neck completely straight in front of it and its long black legs trailing behind it. We can see on its head, it has a featherless red patch on its crown, and that red patch runs all the way right up to its beak. It has this really long, sharp black beak, and it has sort of an orangish amber eye. You can also see that it has this sort of gray or red or kind of brown running throughout its entire body and wings. And oftentimes we get asked, well, what about the red sandhill cranes? Or what about the gray sandhill cranes? Are these two different subspecies that we're seeing here in Wisconsin, or is it a breeding plumage? The answer is actually a little bit strange. And I'm going to show you a close-up of sandhill crane feathers in just a moment. But before I move to the next slide, I want you to notice on this sandhill crane, it appears to be gray up until about halfway down its neck. And then it has its sort of mottled reddish brown mixed with the gray throughout the rest of its body. So right here we have a close-up of sandhill crane feathers. And you can see that there's two kind of distinct feathers mixed in here. We have some very intact, kind of new-looking slate gray feathers mixed in with some feathers that have that sort of reddish brown rusty tint to them, and they appear to be a little bit more disheveled. We also have two images of kind of those red sandhill cranes on top and a gray sandhill crane on bottom. So sandhill cranes do this very unique behavior that essentially helps them to camouflage around their nesting season. So when sandhill cranes return to Wisconsin in the early spring, they're coming back, they're looking for wetlands, and they're looking for places to nest. But at this time, when they're coming back to those wetlands in Wisconsin, these wetlands don't have that super green cattail at that time. Instead, we're seeing cattail that's sort of that brown or kind of dead color. And in order to better blend in with their environment, sandhill cranes need to turn themselves a sort of brown so they can camouflage and increase their safety and the safety of their nest. So in order to better camouflage with their environment, they actually take mud from wetlands and they wipe that all over their feathers. And that mud is very rich in iron. So when the air hits it, it oxidizes and it turns their feathers this sort of rusty red color. Unfortunately, they can't reach their upper neck and their head with their beak, so that still stays that sort of slate gray, and there's kind of that prominent line, which is as far as they can reach with their beak. The next crane that we have here in Wisconsin is the whooping crane. The whooping crane's Latin name is Grus americana. And just like with the sandhill crane, we're going to talk about what a whooping crane sounds like before we move into what a whooping crane looks like. And whooping cranes get their name, the whooping crane, from the sort of whooping-like call that they have. So in listening to this call, I want you to notice how it has a whooping characteristic to it, which is again different from that rattling that we hear with the sandhill crane. So I'm going to play the guard call first, and that's again that sort of alarm call. And for whooping cranes, it sounds kind of like a single note shout. All right, and the next call that we have is again that unison call. And that unison call is two birds calling at the same time, kind of calling in an overlapping sort of way. All right, so whooping cranes, they stand at 5 feet tall. Our sandhill cranes, they're 4 feet. So standing at 5 feet tall, this makes the whooping crane the tallest bird in North America. They also have a very impressive wingspan at about 6 to 7 feet long. We can see here that they have very long black legs, similar to our sandhill crane. They have white throughout their entire body, coming up their very long neck. And then on their head, they have a featherless red patch on their crown, a black sort of mustache-like mask on their cheeks, a bright yellow eye, and sort of a grayish yellow beak. When they're in flight, we can see that whooping cranes are also flying with that long neck outstretched in front of them and those long legs trailing behind them. We see that really impressive wingspan that they have, and right at the tips of their wings are those prominent black wingtips. Unfortunately, because whooping cranes aren't very common on the landscape, there are some much more common birds that are oftentimes mistaken for whooping cranes because they share some features with them, but are missing some of those key characteristics. And some of those birds are pictured here. So we have the American white pelican, the great egret, the great blue heron, and the snow goose. And you can see that they're all slightly similar to whooping cranes. Our American white pelican, it's a large white bird. It has black on its wingtips. But one way to quickly tell that this is an American white pelican and not a whooping crane is that black also runs along the underside of their wings, almost completely to their body. A snow goose looks incredibly similar to a whooping crane, but you can see it has short legs. And then great egrets and great blue herons, they're oftentimes mistaken for whooping cranes or really just cranes in general, because they're also very long-legged, long-necked, wading birds that you're going to find in wetlands. But one way that we can quickly tell egrets and herons apart from cranes when they're in flight is that our cranes are always going to fly with that long neck outstretched in front of them, whereas egrets and herons, they always fly with their neck coiled into a sort of S shape. Another bird that's commonly mistaken for whooping crane is, of course, a sandhill crane. So sandhill cranes share a lot of similar characteristics with whooping cranes. They're incredibly closely related. We often say that they're cousins here in Wisconsin, but one quick way to tell them apart is our whooping cranes are white with black wingtips, and our sandhill cranes are going to be that entirely slate gray or reddish brown sort of color throughout their entire body and wings. So let's talk about the history of these birds. We'll start first with the sandhill crane, and I call the sandhill crane a conservation success story. So in the 1940s, sandhill cranes were almost completely extirpated to the east of the Mississippi River, so much so that this scene that we're seeing in front of us right now, a marsh without cranes in it, became common. At this time, Aldo Leopold believed that cranes could be completely lost from Wisconsin altogether, as he wrote here in Marshland Elegy saying, "The sadness discernible in some marshes arises, perhaps from their once having harbored cranes. Now they stand humbled, adrift in history." So sandhill cranes were quickly removed from the landscape, ultimately due to unregulated hunting and habitat loss. And this had an incredibly massive impact on sandhill cranes because of their life history. At this time, Aldo Leopold estimated that there were only 25 breeding pairs of sandhill cranes left in Wisconsin. They were completely lost from some other eastern states, including Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio. So the sandhill crane life history is ultimately what led to these numbers dropping so quickly because of this unregulated hunting and this habitat loss. But I want to preface this by saying that the sandhill crane life history is not unique to sandhill cranes, but it can also be applied to all 15 species of cranes. So the first thing to know about sandhill cranes and all 15 species of cranes is that they're an incredibly long-lived bird. Sandhill cranes in the wild have been documented living into their 30s, but in captivity they can live to be much older. At the International Crane Foundation, we once cared for a Siberian crane named Wolf who lived to be 83 years old. So on top of being an incredibly long-lived species, it also takes a long time for them to reproduce. Sandhill cranes will typically only lay 1 to 2 eggs per year. They'll sit on those eggs for about 30 days, and then they'll hatch typically just one chick, which is called a colt. Sometimes they'll hatch 2, and then they'll raise that colt throughout the summer. It takes about 80 days for that colt to reach fledging or for it to have the flight feathers and the strength to sustain flight, at which point that chick will then eventually join a bachelor flock of other juveniles who are not at breeding age, and it will stay with this bachelor flock of juvenile birds until it's about 3 to 5 years old, after which it will finally find one single mate, which it will mate with for life, and then it'll enter that slow breeding cycle of laying just 1 to 2 eggs per year, hatching one chick, sometimes 2, and that chick not breeding until it's about 3 to 5 years old. So animals with these sorts of life characteristics, being very long-lived, slow to reach reproductive age, and laying very small clutches, they're often greatly affected by losses to their population. So you may be wondering where sandhill cranes are now, because I did call them a conservation success story, and they're a conservation success story because they've rebounded amazingly. There's now an estimated 800,000 sandhill cranes in the world, and again, they're one of the most abundant crane species in the world. East of the Mississippi River where we live, there's about 90,000 sandhill cranes. And as you can see from this map here, they have a massive range, and that range is continuing to expand east. Today, there exists 6 subspecies of sandhill cranes. 3 of them are migratory. We have the lesser, the Canadian, and the greater. Here in Wisconsin, we see the greater sandhill crane. There's also 3 non-migratory populations of sandhill cranes. We have the Cuban, which is in Cuba, the Florida in Florida, and the Mississippi, which is in Mississippi. So as a species, sandhill cranes are not federally listed, and they're considered to be relatively common. But not all populations of sandhill cranes are stable. So the Cuban sandhill crane and the Mississippi sandhill crane are actually listed as endangered. And some of our crane conservation partners in the Gulf Coast area are actually working on a reintroduction program for Mississippi sandhill cranes that's incredibly similar to the work that we do with whooping cranes here in Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, again, we have the greater sandhill crane, and the greater sandhill crane is incredibly common, which is really due in part to its adaptability to an agricultural landscape. So sandhill cranes in Wisconsin can be predominantly found in 2 different landscape types. They're found in wetlands and they're found in agricultural landscapes. And they prefer to use these two habitat types because both wetlands and agricultural landscapes are flat and they provide abundant food resources. So in wetlands, we'll see that our sandhill cranes are going to be eating things like crayfish, fish, frogs, snakes, berries, roots, tubers, things like that. And then in agricultural fields, they'll eat things like waste grains, or they'll eat the other invertebrates, or maybe reptiles or amphibians or mammals that might be coming through that area as well. So here in Wisconsin, we're going to see the largest concentration of sandhill cranes right around in this region. This is where we see that kind of overlap of those agricultural landscapes and those wetland landscapes as well. But having sandhill cranes on an agricultural landscape is not necessarily a win-win for everybody, as they've actually become a little bit of a pest in these locations. So in the springtime, when sandhill cranes are going to be using some of these agricultural fields, we might see that they're plucking germinating corn seeds straight from the ground, which can create a scene similar to this, where you can see each piece of corn has been plucked straight from the ground, and that's not advantageous for farmers. So because of this, the International Crane Foundation has worked with other specialists to create a seed coating that's called Avapel. And essentially it has a bad taste. It can be applied to corn seed and it acts as a taste deterrent or a bird repellent. So if cranes pick that corn seed out of the ground, it tastes bad and they don't feel compelled to continue eating the corn in that field. Avapel is scientifically proven to greatly reduce corn loss. And as an organization, it's the option that we endorse to prevent crop depredation by cranes. So the next crane that we have here in Wisconsin, that is the whooping crane. And I call the whooping crane the story of perseverance, cooperation, and creativity, as this is a conservation effort that is still being played out on our landscape. So historically, whooping cranes would have had a massive range. Pre-European expansion, it was predicted that there were around 10,000 whooping cranes in the fertile wetlands and prairies of North America. We would have seen that they would have been breeding as far north as the Arctic, coming through Canada and the northern Midwest. They then would have migrated really through the bulk of the United States to then spend their winter months in either central Mexico or coastal Gulf of Mexico area. However, by the 1940s, that number dropped to only 20 whooping cranes left in the wild. So when European settlers moved into these areas in North America, these fertile wetlands and prairies that our whooping cranes would have been using, these areas were lush with resources. But at this time, unfortunately, game laws were mostly ignored and they were rarely enforced. So ultimately, this led to unrestrained hunting and destruction of wild areas that really grew into the 1800s and led to the extinction of many species, one of which was the passenger pigeon that would have been found here in Wisconsin. As you can see from this image of a man who's posing with the animals he's hunted that day, there's a whooping crane that he has on display, and right above it, there's a sandhill crane as well. But unfortunately, as whooping cranes became more scarce on the landscape as a result of this unregulated hunting, their value increased. And with that increase in value, we saw an increase in unregulated hunting, as well as an increase in egg collecting. And egg collecting can have pretty detrimental impacts on whooping cranes, again, because of their life history, which is shared with sandhill cranes. Whooping cranes are also very long-lived. It takes them a long time to reach breeding age. And once they are breeding, they're only laying about 1 to 2 eggs each year, typically hatching just 1 chick. So what we're seeing with this population is that we have adults that are in the population that are at breeding age and they're being hunted out of the population. And then we have adults that are able to survive the hunting season and are able to lay eggs, but now their eggs are getting collected off of their nests. Essentially, we're seeing that this population isn't able to reproduce or add individuals to the population, and numbers are going to start dropping very, very quickly. Some other massive contributors to the decline of whooping cranes include the millinery trade and habitat loss. So the millinery trade was essentially the trade for bird feathers, which at this time were used to adorn women's hats for fashion. And some of the most sought after feathers were those of very colorful birds or those of very large white birds that could make large white plumes like the one that's pictured here. So the millinery trade, unfortunately, is also credited with driving many bird species that could have been found in this region to extinction. It drove the Carolina parakeet, a very colorful bird, to extinction, and it could have driven the whooping crane to extinction as well. But luckily for the whooping crane, some high society women from Boston, they noticed this issue, and they formed the first Audubon Society, which was the Massachusetts Audubon Society, and it banned the trade of wild bird feathers. Another massive contributor to the decline of whooping cranes was habitat loss, which was largely driven by the Homestead Act of the 1860s. And this act essentially encouraged people to rapidly move out west, and in doing so, convert hundreds of thousands of acres of this fertile wetland and prairie habitat to an agricultural landscape, which took away a valuable resource not only for whooping cranes, but also many other wetland-dependent species. So when people began to notice not only the decline of whooping cranes, but the loss of some of these common birds and wild spaces, it resulted in a series of laws to protect these spaces and species. The first of which was the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is still an act that we see today, protects all migratory birds from illegal take, so illegal hunting of these birds, taking of their eggs, their feathers, their nests, any sort of thing like that. In 1934, we saw the passage of the Duck Stamp Act, and if you're familiar with wetlands or hunting, you may be familiar with the Duck Stamp Act. Again, it's something that we still see today, and essentially it's a federal art competition to design these duck stamps that are then sold to hunters to hunt on federal lands, and that money is then recirculated back into conservation. So today, the Duck Stamp Act has raised over $850 million to protect 6.5 million acres of wildlife habitat. In 1966, we saw the creation of the refuge system, which is incredibly important for whooping cranes, as many whooping cranes continue to use refuge lands, one of which is the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, where many whooping cranes will spend their winters in Texas. And here in Wisconsin, whooping cranes will also use national wildlife refuges. So we'll see in Wisconsin that the whooping cranes here, they typically are found at Horicon National Wildlife Refuge and Necedah National Wildlife Refuge. In 1972, we saw the passage of the Clean Water Act, which was also incredibly important for whooping cranes because it resulted in greater conservation for these aquatic habitats that they used, such as wetlands. And then finally, in 1973, we saw the passage of the Endangered Species Act, which is also incredibly important for whooping cranes. At this time, their numbers had risen from those 20 in the 1940s to now 70 whooping cranes by 1973, and they were listed as endangered at this time. Whooping cranes are still listed as endangered today, because none of their populations are at the point of being self-sustaining or at the point where they're no longer reliant on the International Crane Foundation or our crane conservation partners to continue putting fledglings out into the population or have kind of a heavy hand in continued management and monitoring of these populations. So you may be wondering, where are whooping cranes now? So if you remember that massive population that we saw before that spanned through the Arctic, coming through much of the United States, and then migrating all the way down to spend their winters in central Mexico and coastal Gulf of Mexico, that population, predicted to be 10,000, dropped to 20, has since been reduced to a single flyway, which is known as the Aransas wood buffalo population. As these birds will spend their summer months up at Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada, they'll then migrate through the central flyway and then spend their winter months at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in coastal Texas. In the 1990s, the International Crane Foundation and some of our crane conservation partners also worked to reintroduce a non-migratory population of whooping cranes to Florida. In 2001, they also reintroduced a migratory population of whooping cranes to the eastern United States, known as the Eastern Migratory Population, or the EMP. This population is the one that lives in Wisconsin today. So this population is here right now. They're up in Wisconsin, and they are going to be spending their time again at Necedah and Horicon National Wildlife Refuge, where they'll be nesting, hatching chicks, and raising their chicks, and eventually they'll leave on their migration, which was originally taught to be a migration all the way down to Florida. But today we'll typically see them spending their winter months maybe in northern Alabama, Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge, or in western Indiana. And then most recently in 2011, they reintroduced a non-migratory population to Louisiana. But for today, again, we're really going to focus just on that eastern migratory population, or that EMP, as that's the one that we see here in Wisconsin today. So the eastern migratory population, or again, the EMP, is a reintroduced population of whooping cranes, and it was started when birds hatched and raised in captivity for release were then released out into the wild. So this process is incredibly labor intensive and expensive, but it was really necessary to bring whooping cranes back to Wisconsin. So the methods that I'm going to talk about are still being used today to help this population grow, which is again because it's not yet at the point of being self-sustaining. And there are really many steps to this process, but for simplicity's sake, the first step is going to be breeding these captive birds to lay fertile eggs. And we ultimately do that through artificial insemination, which is what is pictured here with our curator and our chick rearing supervisor. And we do this because whooping cranes form partnerships for life. But we're talking about a population that underwent a very severe genetic bottleneck in the 1940s when only 20 individuals were left out in the wild. So there's really low genetic diversity in that population. And in order to have healthy populations, you need high genetic diversity, which can be pretty hard to accomplish if you have individuals that breed with the same bird over and over again, year after year after year. So in captivity, the whooping cranes that live at the International Crane Foundation, these birds, they're given a mate that they're able to kind of have a social partnership with. So they live with that individual, they'll sit on eggs with them, they'll raise chicks with them, but that's not actually the individual that they're breeding with. Ultimately, we use genetic recommendations to design or decide who is going to breed with who so that we can have that increased genetic diversity. So we have eggs hatching that have high diversity. So we have healthy captive flocks and healthy wild flocks. So then when the eggs that are hatched, we're able to then raise chicks, and we then raise those chicks for release. And we use a special technique that teaches these young birds everything they need to know about how to survive in the wild. So we have two methods for raising chicks that are released into the wild, and those two methods are parent rearing and costume rearing. So parent rearing is the more natural preferred method, and this is where chicks are able to hatch on nests of captive whooping crane pairs that have proven to be strong parents. They raise those chicks, teach them everything they need to know about how to be a bird in the wild, and then eventually those chicks are released out into the wild. But oftentimes more chicks are hatching in captivity than we have birds that are able to raise those chicks at the International Crane Foundation. And this is where costume rearing comes in. And costume rearing is really important for raising whooping crane chicks because whooping cranes, like many birds, they imprint. And imprinting is essentially a rapid learning process where a young bird learns its identity. So if we come into a young chick and we come in looking, sounding, acting, talking like a human being, that chick is going to get the wrong identity for itself. It might think that it's a human being and not a whooping crane. So when it's released out into the wild, it's not going to want to spend time with other whooping cranes. It's not going to want to breed with other whooping cranes, and it may spend time around human areas, which can be pretty dangerous for whooping cranes. So ultimately, we use this method of costume rearing in which we look, sound, and act like whooping cranes to give them the correct image and behaviors and sounds to imprint on so they understand their own identity before they're released into the wild. And pictured here is kind of the anatomy of the costumes that are used to raise these whooping crane chicks for release out into the wild. So you can see the biologist that is wearing this costume. They're covered by kind of an entire white covering over their body. This makes up kind of the large white body of the whooping crane. Their left arm acts as their wing, so it's mostly tucked in most of the time, but when they pop it out, you can see those prominent black wingtips. And then their right arm acts as sort of the long neck of the whooping crane, and at the top, there's a puppet head that has that featherless red patch on the crown, that sort of black mustache-like mask, that yellow eye, and that grayish yellow beak. So it's all of the same features that we saw from that wild whooping crane. But looking like a whooping crane when raising these chicks for release isn't necessarily enough. They also need to act like whooping cranes and sound like them. So our biologists, they spend a lot of time observing the captive and the wild populations. They can understand their behaviors. So when they're wearing these costumes, they're doing things like preening with the puppet bill, or they're foraging on the ground or drinking water, or they might be looking around and being alert, or they might be roosting and tucking their heads, teaching those whooping crane chicks kind of all of the behaviors that they need to know. It's also important that they don't sound like humans, but instead sound like whooping cranes. So the biologists that are wearing these costumes and playing parent crane, they're not speaking around the chicks, but instead they're broadcasting this sort of contact call, which is a soft sort of purring call that a whooping crane makes when it's communicating with its chicks. And I'll play that call for you now. But these costumes are incredibly important for raising whooping crane chicks because they teach them everything they need to know about survival. As you can see from these images, this costume is teaching these chicks how to forage. It's socializing them as a flock. It's teaching them how to use wetlands, where you can see the whooping crane costume is remaining alert while the other birds are foraging. And it even teaches them how to fly. So once these fledglings have been raised successfully either by whooping cranes or by whooping crane costumes, it's now time for them to be released. And the releases can go about many different ways, but the one that's pictured here is the soft release option. And this is essentially where whooping cranes are put out into a wild wetland in a temporary pen. They're given time to acclimate to that wild wetland, and over time that pen is slowly taken apart until these birds are completely out in the wild. So this entire process of hatching, raising, and releasing whooping crane chicks for the wild, as you can see, it's very time consuming, but it's also, again, very expensive. The cost for raising just one of these chicks to be released into the wild is about $100,000 per bird. And once the whooping crane chicks are out in the wild, our work is not done. We now need to continue to monitor that population, learn about the behaviors that they're doing, the habitats they're using, the spaces they're occupying, the migration routes they're making, the other birds that they're associating with, and maybe if they're starting to form those life partnerships or starting to breed or successfully hatch and raise chicks. So all of the birds that are released into this eastern migratory population here in Wisconsin, they're given color bands, and many of them are given a radio tag as well. And this allows us to track those birds as they move along their migration route. So our team of scientists here at the International Crane Foundation, as well as many volunteers along the flyway, they track our birds and they use this information to further research and knowledge about whooping cranes. Wild adults can also be closely monitored through different techniques such as different types of transmitters, nest cameras, aerial surveys, ground surveys, volunteers, and of course reports from the general public. So we rely really heavily on citizen science reportings of whooping cranes to tell us what spaces the whooping cranes are using. So as you can see from these images of the whooping cranes here, they all have those colorful leg bands on their legs, and those bands are all unique combinations. So each bird that's released out into the wild will have a unique combination of these colors on their legs, and this essentially tells us that bird's identity. So only one bird ever will have on their left leg white, green, red, and on their right leg white, red. And this essentially tells us their identity. So if you spot a whooping crane out in the wild, and you're able to see those leg bands, we ask that you take note of those leg bands and let the International Crane Foundation know where you saw that bird so you can be actively involved in helping us to protect these species out in the wild. So again, if you see a whooping crane in Wisconsin, look for those bands on those legs. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to see where the birds are. So the first step in reporting a banded whooping crane is to confirm that you saw a whooping crane. And you can use those tips and tricks that I talked about at the start of the presentation. It's a 5-foot tall white bird, long black legs, long white neck, featherless red patch on their crown, black mustache-like mask, grayish yellow beak, and a bright yellow eye. Next, you can check if there are whooping crane reportings in your area. And you can do that by heading to our website at whoopermap.savingcranes.org. And that will take you to this screen where it says, where are the whoopers? And that's an active map of whooping crane sightings that have been reported. And as you can see here, those sightings are just specific to county, but you'll see if there are birds that have been reported in your area or if you might be the first sighting in your area. And then we ask that you go and report your sighting, and you can do that by reporting a banded whooping crane from the Whooper map or heading to bandedcranes.org. When sharing with us the location of that whooping crane, we ask that you share very specific location information. If you have photographs, that's really helpful as well. If you see those colorful leg bands, we'd love to hear from you as well to see if those bands, if that's the bird that's in that area, or if we know the identity of that bird. All of that's really helpful to us. We do ask, though, if you want to share that sort of information about your whooping crane sighting with your friends, your family, or social media, you don't share any information more specific than the county that those birds are found in. So whooping cranes are incredibly sensitive to disturbance, and we want to make sure that we're limiting disturbance or limiting people kind of flocking per se out to go see these birds. So we like to keep their location very private, and we only share the county they can be found in. But again, we ask that you share that very specific location information with the International Crane Foundation when you spot the birds. So today, across all of the wild and captive flocks of whooping cranes, there are about 800 birds. You can see here 136 live in captivity. Not all of them live at the International Crane Foundation. About 30 whooping cranes are there. And then the other about 650 can be found in the wild. So that historic population that dropped to 20 birds has now risen to about 506. That's at a Aransas wood buffalo migratory population. Our 1990s reintroduced Florida population sits at about 7 birds. We've actually halted reintroduction efforts into this population because we very quickly found that there was unstable habitat there and a high risk of bobcat predation. And at the cost of releasing a whooping crane chick costing about $100,000 per bird, that's a pretty expensive meal ticket for a bobcat. The eastern migratory population, that 2001 release that exists here in Wisconsin, sits at about 80 birds, and the most recent reintroduced population in Louisiana sits at about 72. So in just about 70 years, we've really seen a significant recovery of this species, and this story is really proof that by working together, scientists, governments, and communities can really save a species from the brink of extinction. Our work, however, is not done. Whooping cranes are continuing to face threats around the United States, and especially here in our eastern population. And these threats are resulting in the mortalities of adult whooping cranes, and that can be a major setback for these populations' growth. And some of the major threats that these birds are continuing to face are threats of habitat loss, power line collisions, and poaching. But we're really just focused on two of them today, being power line collisions and poaching. The first of which is power line collisions. So a 2008 report by researchers from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Texas State University found that power line collisions are the #1 known cause of mortality for recently fledged migratory whooping cranes. So because of this, crane conservation organizations, they've worked very closely with power companies to suggest alternative strategies that may decrease whooping crane collisions and deaths, such as burying power lines underground in some of those key stopover areas that whooping cranes are using. So typically stop over at night on their migration. They'll use some of the same areas year after year after year. And these are the areas where these power lines can pose a risk because whooping cranes will be flying closer to the ground. They're much less alert, they're tired, and they're not going to spot these power lines. This is when they run the risk of colliding with them. So if it's not possible for them to be buried in these areas, we also ask that they're then marked with some of these highly visible, highly reflective, sometimes even mobile markers that can be clipped onto the lines and essentially make them much more visible so that whooping cranes can better avoid them on their migration. Another unfortunate leading cause of whooping crane mortalities is whooping crane deaths due to gunshot or due to poaching. And as an organization that's working to reintroduce these populations and help to build these populations to the point where they can be self-sustaining, we wanted to know why whooping cranes were getting shot. And what we found is that most of these shootings were occurring in conjunction with other illegal activities, such as drinking while driving or shooting non-game wildlife or shooting game wildlife out of season. And they're not actually linked with some of these hunting accidents or incidents where there's a misidentification of these birds. And through this, we realized that whooping cranes really need to be protected in the communities that they live in. And in order to decrease the incidences of this crime of shooting a whooping crane or poaching these whooping cranes, we really need to build communities that support whooping cranes or communities that give a whoop about whooping cranes, as this approach has been found to greatly reduce wildlife crimes in past studies. And we've ultimately been doing this through a whooping crane outreach program that's been implemented here in Wisconsin, in Indiana, and in Alabama, which are some of those eastern migratory population flyway states that see the most whooping cranes throughout the year. What we've found is that if a community doesn't know about or care about having cranes on their landscape, ultimately there's lack of guardianship for these birds in that community, and we don't see a decrease in incidences of shooting or a change in offender motivations. So we've been implementing this outreach program since 2015. We've also been doing additional work most recently in Texas and Louisiana as well with those populations. But with our outreach programs, we've really been making meaningful connections through K-12 school programming. We're oftentimes doing this because the average age of offenders for whooping crane poaching is only 26 years old. So we want to make sure children know how to identify whooping cranes. They know their importance and the work that we're doing to protect them from a very early age. We're also engaging very closely with outdoor recreationists, naturalists, hunters, gun owners, birders, conservationists, really people who are already outside, as they're much more likely to encounter a whooping crane. We want to provide them with all of the best educational materials to correctly identify whooping cranes and make safe and smart choices around them. So one of the tools that we use is our large water birds identification guide. And as you can see from this guide, it helps with identifying whooping cranes versus sandhill cranes versus some other large white water birds. And in this guide, we also have information on how to safely interact with whooping cranes, how to report banded cranes to the International Crane Foundation, and numbers to call to report any sort of harassment or poaching of whooping cranes. Additionally, we're also working very closely with lawmakers to increase penalties for whooping crane shooting cases to make poaching less attractive. And we're also working very closely with our partners in zoos to share with their visitors how zoos and other conservation organizations are really all working together to bring whooping cranes back to the North American landscape. Closest to you would be at the Milwaukee County Zoo. We've recently worked with them to partner with them to create these whooping crane conservation carts. They're educational carts or tools that are put outside of the whooping crane exhibit at that zoo. And right here we have our I Give a Whoop campaign. So we hand out these stickers oftentimes at our outreach programs, so people can share with their communities or with their friends why they give a whoop about whooping cranes. And we can get that symbol of a whooping crane or those identifying features a little bit more prevalent in the public eye. So you may be wondering, what can I do to help Wisconsin's cranes? Unfortunately, there are many ways that you can help Wisconsin's cranes. So we like to say that you can help Wisconsin's cranes by being a crane hero. So the first way to be a crane hero is know how to identify Wisconsin's cranes and safely look for them on the landscape. So know the difference between whooping cranes and sandhill cranes. Remember to give these birds their space. With whooping cranes, we always ask that you stay at least 2 football fields or 200 yards away from them at all time. If these birds are out on public property, such as at Horicon or Necedah, please remember to stay on the trail. Don't try and get any closer to them. If they're on private property, we ask that you respect private property, only park in designated parking spaces. We also ask that if you spot these birds, you remember to report those banded cranes to bandedcranes.org. And if you spot any incidents of poaching or harassment, to contact local authorities about that as well. Another way you can be a crane hero is talk to your friends and legislators about cranes in Wisconsin. Share with them why you give a whoop about whooping cranes and why you support legislation that protects wetlands and protects cranes. You can also volunteer to be a whooping crane ambassador. We have some wonderful volunteer opportunities at our site in Baraboo, Wisconsin. We also offer wonderful outreach volunteer opportunities that could be in your own community as well. And then finally, you can be a crane hero by heading to our website, savingcranes.org. You can learn a little bit more about whooping cranes, sandhill cranes, and the other 13 species of cranes. We're also a membership organization, so if you're interested in supporting the work that we do, you can find more information about membership at savingcranes.org. All right, and then finally, I do want to end my presentation by inviting you all to come to Baraboo to come and see our site. We are the only place on Earth that has all 15 species of cranes. Typically at zoos, you'll only see 1 to 2 species, but you can see all 15 at the International Crane Foundation. We are newly renovated and we reopened our crane gates in 2020. We'd love to see you there and share with you the work that we're doing around the world to protect all 15 species of cranes and the habitats that they use. So we're open from May 1st through October 31st, 9 to 5 every single day. And we have wonderful opportunities for public tours, ways that you can engage with our naturalists that we have on site, and also engage with some of our staff to ask some more questions about the work that we do. And again, we are a membership organization. So if you're interested in becoming a member, that's again at savingcranes.org. All right, so I do want to open it up to any questions that you have for me about cranes here in Wisconsin. I want to thank Tim and the Urban Ecology Center for inviting me to give this program today. So thank you.